at SPC, we're all essentially, in varying degrees of the -1 kind of like, I would say, journey, trying to figure out which ideas are worth tackling, trying to gain conviction in an idea. So I'm curious, like back when you were starting off and you were kind of like trying to figure out what to dedicate your time to, how did you go through that process?
My first startup was called Daisy Systems. It was a CAD company. I actually started the whole field of CAD practically. Before that, there was graphics that was meant to be CAD, but if two lines crossed, it didn't mean there was a circuit connection. There was no database under the graphics. So it was a direct paper translation. That was quite successful, went public. I did that right out of business school, and that worked pretty well. But one of the things I realized is you have to have the right teams with, more importantly, the right values. And I didn't share values with either especially the investors. There, Fred Adler was our investor. I don't mind naming names. uh, 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 but being values aligned is really, really important. So I left and then started looking at two different ideas, both with Scott McNeely. One was a temporary sort of, it'd be fun to do this kind of idea. And we sort of did that in a very bad way. That failed. But we really also focused on what is the core technology idea. And I found Andy Bechtolsheim, and I decided I wanted to work with Andy. By the way, one of the really important lessons, Andy was developing the Sun workstation at Stanford. Sun used to stand for Stanford University Network. So that's where the name came from. And he was licensing his design because he was a graduate student for $10,000 a pop. I said, and this is a really important lesson. He had licensed it to 6 other people, which in those days, $60,000 for a grad student was a shitload of money.
I think it still is a shitload of money, even with inflation.
Yeah, but think of inflation adjusted from $1980. But I said, no, Andy, I want the goose that laid the golden egg. I don't want the golden egg. And in the end, he became a co-founder, which took me a lot of time because I had to convince him to drop his PhD. Then we went over to Berkeley and convinced Bill Joy to drop his PhD. I was good at selling, and you do a lot of selling. But the team you build ends up being the company you build. When most people said, well, you can license the technology and you'll be fine. In fact, none of the other players, and there were 6 others, including Jim Clark at Netscape, who had done silicon graphics, licensed the same technology, but never came to much. Because one principal lesson I've learned across the years, the team you build initially is the company you build. And SPC does a great job. In fact, this is the one piece of advice I keep giving YC. They don't do a good job of helping build teams. And you're doing essentially that.
I have no comment on YC. But, I'd say that, but maybe, I think, how many of you ever have used a Sun kind of like terminal? It's kind of amazing. So I went to Carnegie Mellon. So back in I got there in 2000. I was there for 4 years. And all our terminals in the computer labs were basically, well, the good ones were Sun. You could also use the Linux machines, but at that point, they weren't that great. And I think it's kind of hard to understand today just how good those machines were. And then obviously, and again, the kids today don't use Java, but Java was kind of like the programming language that all of us were taught like as being essentially the gold standard back in 2000.
And by the way, there's an important lesson there. We had decided we're much smaller than almost anybody else in the computing business. So the most common piece of advice I got was, why don't you build terminals for DECVAXes or something like that? And I said, I want the whole enchilada. I don't want just the trimmings. So we went for the more ambitious goal because we had the right team. But one of the things we did is to gain mindshare, because you're a small, tiny startup. And in fact, Apollo was a workstation startup much larger than us and with fancier management. And they had martinis at lunch. We had McDonald's. We decided to go look for unusual leverage and wanted to penetrate every computer science department in the country in those days. And the reason I tell this story, because many of you are at this stage, we could talk forever. Finding unusual leverage is a key to a startup. And we said, we want all the universities to be using SUNS, and identified the 50 computer science departments we'd be in, made a rule nobody could travel without visiting a university that was closest to where they were going. And in the first year alone, we got 42 of the 50 computer science departments we had targeted. And it became unusual source of credibility because wherever corporate people went or whoever they hired, they had heard about SUN.
So I mean, how did you figure that out? Was that simply like, where did you get this like moment of insight?
Well, our competitors had a lot more money, a lot more advertising. We didn't have money for any of that. So we had to get creative.